Academy for Park and Recreation Administration has a series to document the experiences of the leadership within the profession, and something that can be shared with those that will be leaders in the future, something to give the experiences and the values of its legends, as the program is called. My name is Maxwell Ramsey. I am a fellow in the Academy, and here this morning with my good friend and compatriot Darrel Lewis, also a fellow in the Academy. Darrel is the former chief of the Natural Resource Management Branch of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That's a national program with over $300 million average annual budget, a very significant cross-section of resource concerns, including recreation, wildlife, cultural, and others. And we want to find out about Darrel's experiences, and he's here to share them with us. It's a pretty big program, Darrel. A lot of responsibilities cutting across a lot of boundaries, including political. So we want to find out a little about you and your background. How shall we start?
Well, let me just kind of explain how I got in this line of work. I grew up in southwestern Washington State and was a loner and out and back, which probably some of these areas are now called wildernesses. I didn't know any better. I just rode. And so I was convinced I wanted something to do with the outdoors, and ended up going into forestry because that's a nice, safe thing for an introverted country kid. And I realized over time that I was more comfortable with people than I realized I was. And so I grew up in a rural environment and was actually discouraged from going to college because I was on the other side of the tracks type thing. I was the first individual from my family to even try to go to college. And but I really just felt like the outdoors is where I wanted to spend my career, and I had to find a way to take advantage of that, and I thought forestry would do it. Now, when I started off on my educational background, I went over to Washington State University in the forestry program. I went there because they didn't have a summer camp. Well, that's because summer camp would take away from my ability to earn money to pay for school. I couldn't afford to go to one of the schools that had a summer camp because that took away my earning power. So, and then I went off into the Army, and I went into the original oxymoron, Army intelligence. And there I worked with people on all kinds of things. And I discovered I really wasn't the introvert I thought I was. I really enjoyed working with people, and I said, what am I going to do now? I really don't want to be a straight forester anymore. And so as I finished up my tour of duty down in the southeast with the Army Intelligence, I started looking around and decided that I could compromise best by going into what at that time was called forest recreation. And so I applied to a number of schools and was fortunate enough to be accepted at the University of Michigan. Worked under Grant Sharp up there. And I've never looked back. I've been fortunate enough to spend my entire career in outdoor recreation. So not many people can say that.
And Grant Sharp is certainly a recognizable name in that time period as a great leader and a great teacher. So tell us about your career then. You left school and went where?
That's where we met. As I was leaving, finishing up my master's degree at Michigan, I made application to the Tennessee Valley Authority. Knew not much about it, but I thought they had a recreation program. And glory be, things worked out, and I actually got a job there. I started out in Morristown, Tennessee. And TVA is a really unique agency, and I had good fortune of having some supervisors there that just, I was so impressed. W.K. Seaman, I still remember him. He was the assistant district manager at Morristown. And he was a quiet New Englander, kind of terse, but the more I got to know him, the more I grew to respect him. And I think he gave me a lot of work ethic help then, and he was never one to chide, but I always wanted to please him, and we had a great working relationship. And then I came up into the office with you and the rest of the group when they centralized, and then moved on to the Bureau of Land Management, and ended up being the chief of their Recreation and Cultural Resources division for a number of years.
Yeah, in fact, I was doing interagency work in Washington and got to know your predecessor, Bill Holmes, Ellen Holmes, real well. And he was about to retire and suggested he needed to talk to a gentleman by the name of Darrel Lewis, and it kind of went from there.
Forever thankful, sir. Now you see why you're here. We are intertwined. Bill was a real gentleman, and I felt fortunate to work there. We don't have to go into it, but showing up and being put in, interagency commissions or groups right away, I really felt like I was in over my head a couple times there, but I persevered. I faked it, and was very pleased with the Bureau of Land Management experience. And then after a number of years, I moved on to the Army Corps of Engineers, and that's where I finished out my career. I spent about 21 years as Chief of Natural Resources in the Army Corps of Engineers headquarters in Washington, D.C.
Well, you certainly had a lot of experiences with a variety of locations, as well as the difference in regional resources across the country, and wound up in the Corps with a national concern as a part of kind of the combination of civil service and U.S. Army. But how did you get involved in professional level organizations?
Well, early on, I joined the National Recreation Parks Association. It was the thing, and since in TVA I was working in recreation, and I've always felt like there was a need to, if you're going to call yourself a professional, you have to pull your weight in the profession. And I was just a junior flunky, but I joined, and I was fortunate enough to go to some of the national and regional meetings, and made a lot of friends, people who I value their judgment. People you've heard about, and you actually get to talk with them. It's quite a thing for a young professional, and found that the profession was populated. And just talked last night with one of those people, Chuck Odegaard, who I'll never forget as the most gentleman professional I think I've ever known. And I know you and I have warm feelings about him.
Absolutely.
But did that, and obviously then moved to the National Society for Park Resources, the branch within NRPA that matched up with the natural resource orientation. I actually ended up being president of that organization for a term, and enjoyed quite a few years on the board there. So I also worked in the Society of American Foresters, being a forester as well, and worked in their recreation subgroup section. That wasn't quite as viable, so I kind of withered on the vine on that and spent more time with the NRPA group.
You were involved in the accreditation program process?
Yeah, it's one of those give back things. If you're going to be a professional, you need to get involved. And I can't even remember why now, but somehow the National Accreditation Council, which is responsible for accrediting the schools involved in this field, and it's jointly sponsored by NRPA. And somehow I guess it was NSPR that had a representative, and so I raised my hand at the wrong time and volunteered to serve on that council. And it was a really rewarding thing. It's grueling because you're given these big analyses of a very school's curriculum, and you have to evaluate it, and then you bring the poor department head in, and then you grill them and decide whether or not, as a council, that you actually grant them accreditation. And you think that's a rubber stamp, then you don't know how it works, because more than one individual went out and said, well, we would welcome you back in a year if you correct these flaws. And it was tense and difficult, and a lot of emotion went on, and a great group of people. So I spent 2 tours on that council, and it was some of the most rewarding work I ever did.
Well, that was some of the early work in it, but the accreditation program has really taken on a new meaning, and it's, you might say, cause célèbre within the profession now to achieve that level. And it's much more important because of this early work, and so I'm
Yeah.
sure it must have been
This
rewarding
was the
for
educational institution accreditation, and now they've gone to the individual accreditation.
well, both, yeah,
Yeah.
but particularly the
And now
institutional
agency,
side.
yeah, and now agency accreditation,
Right.
which is something that I think is, I actually took the early training on that because I think it's just an excellent concept that's
It raised the
working.
bar in
Yeah,
professionalism
that's
and
right.
what it meant in the field. And then you became an academy member.
Yeah, a couple people kept trying to get me to fill out the papers, and I really didn't have time to fill out papers. Lou Twardzik from Michigan State was one of them.
Oh, yeah.
Yourself was another. Kept saying, Darrell, fill out that stuff, and we think you ought to be on the academy. And I said, well, and finally my secretary filled out the material. she talked to one of you and said, Darrell, I'm going to fill this stuff out, and then you check it. And so that's how it got done. I never did fill out
Well,
the
we'll
paperwork.
have to thank her.
Yeah, Tina Bush
Got
was her
you
name,
here.
wonderful lady.
What about the changes that have happened during this transition
Oh,
period here?
boy. That, I've given some thought to that in preparing for this. And I guess the one thing that I think was of all is the immediate transfer of information. Now, it's easy to accept the internet and all that now, but when you and I started, it wasn't like that. You didn't know everything immediately. Now, and it's not so much you and I that I'm concerned about, it's the public at large. And so if anything happens, they're on it now. And so that means you have to stay up on what's happening, because the next person coming through that door is going to be talking about something that maybe happened 3 hours ago. And that has been a huge change in the way things work in all fields, but in our field as well. But there are some other things that happen. I mean, you can't ignore the population growth and what's happened in terms of pressure on public lands. And I spent most of my career managing public lands, and the pressures and that nasty word greed, because there's always somebody there trying to make a buck, and in my opinion, at the expense of the general public. And that's one of the things I saw. The diversity of the public. I mean, look at what's happened in our population. The huge growth of ethnic groups, the Asian, black, and Hispanics. It changes the way public land managers have to work. And it's a real challenge, because when you try to recruit people from those groups, they're so sought after, it's hard to get them on your own staffs. And so you find yourself us and them, and you can't afford that. And so it's been a real frustrating area, but the change has been significant.
Well, the onset of the Outdoor Recreation Resources Review Commission kind of brought out a whole set of landmark pieces of legislation, policy changes that gave some credence and status to concerns about those resources that hadn't happened at the national level. It opened some doors for things to happen. So how long has it been since you retired now?
I retired in September of '02.
'02.
So it's 4 years.
So, you know, thinking back, there's been probably a good bit of evolution in the role of professional staff, the understanding of recreation and what it means. What do you think about that side?
Well, I think we're going to get into that a little deeper later on, but in a nutshell, there are some extremely talented professionals out there, and some of them are well trained, some aren't. You know, it's a shame, but we have an unevenness, and I guess that's because we're all human beings. I think that a lot of our professionals are ill prepared to take on some of the challenges of today, because it's political, it's economic, and it's not about feel good. Feel good's great, but that doesn't cut it. And it's a frustrating area for me, because I don't see people well enough prepared to take on the issues, because you're talking big league stuff. You know, these are people who are talking of tens of millions of dollars, and they have the connections politically. And I'm thinking of some conversations I've had where I've just got literally chewed out by members of the House Representatives. Senate's a more astute group, but the House members, they're really, they'll let fly. And you just have to hold your ground, but you have to be well prepared. You have to have a rational view, because it's not so much convincing that politician, but you got to convince your boss back home that you're doing the right thing and that what you're saying has value. So you have to be able to describe the values of what the position you're taking, not just say it's only right. You know, that doesn't cut it. So there's a whole thing about understanding the well, it's essentially like a negotiation. You have to understand where the values are on both sides of something, and then you look for ways to proceed. And you understand kind of where the politicians are coming from, because they've got a constituent that wants something usually. And then you have to figure out a way to ameliorate that into something that where you can actually look yourself in the mirror and say, you know, we did well. Sometimes we won, sometimes we lost. And you didn't have time to keep score. You just move on to the next one.
So you kind of have to be able to withstand the pressure of the moment and stick by your values and your programs and what you're trying to communicate. And I guess it can be different depending on the politician you're talking to.
Oh, yeah. And it's all based on your understanding of why you're there. Who are you representing? And I took, my roots are basic, and so I always considered myself a blue-collar person with pride. And the constituents of the Corps of Engineers is the blue-collar group. You get out there and look, you're going to see the bass boat and the water skiers, campers and all that. They're wonderful people. They're me. That's who. And it was easy for me to represent them. I understood where they were coming from, and I wasn't against everything, but if something threatened their enjoyment of those public lands, then I had to get involved and I had to take positions. And it was really easy because I understood that, but also the training. If you don't understand the relationship between leisure activities and the quality of life, and I think it's something even bigger than that, I think it has to do with the productivity and the really fiber of this nation. And when you understand that, you can get in somebody's face in a hurry. But you had to have that underpinning. It's not just kind of saying, well, this is what's right. You had to have that passion to understand, well, this is why it's important. And I'm here to tell you that we need to take this position, because I'd have to sell my supervisors before I went over on the Hill or wherever I was at.
Well, you and I kind of have similar experiences in that we both had to try to sell recreation and historic preservation and conservation to engineers.
Yeah.
I had about a 32-year career in TVA that dealt with those subjects, and yours was with the Corps.
Lord love the engineers. They suffer a lot.
Yeah,
but they just don't know it. One of the areas in terms of this foundation of understanding I'd like to talk about a little bit, and that's the evolution of the understanding of leisure activities, or some people call it recreation. It's more than that. When I first started, it was basically kind of an activity-oriented thing. People went camping, they went boating, and we needed to allow space for them to do that. That was about all we really understood about it, and so we built facilities or we maintained facilities, and that was recreation. But over time, we began to realize that there was more to it than that. And so we began to look at some of the what we called back then the recreation opportunities. It was kind of a management tool, the recreation opportunities spectrum. And that looked at all the way from wilderness to urban experiences. And as we worked with that, I know when I was in the BLM, working with Roy Forcher from the Forest Service, we carried that, and we had the underpinnings of research, people like Bev Driver and Perry Brown, George Peterson these are all Forest Service research people. We brought this forward to say, okay, here's what's really going on. It's more than just people out there camping. Here's the kind of experiences they're looking for and all that. So as we manage, we have to understand that. But darn, that didn't really solve things. We still, we kind of had a better kind of put things in their own little clusters, but we still didn't know what the heck we were doing. And Dr. Beverly Driver at the Forest Experiment Station, Rocky Mountain, he's the guy I give full credit for this next thought. But he started talking about the benefits of leisure. what are benefits? So I said, well, you're healthier, your mental health is better, your productivity at the office is better. I learned that back when I worked for TVA. I worked with Eastman Kodak, and I worked with the industrial recreation guy from Eastman Kodak, and we worked on Bay Mountain up there in East Tennessee. And I asked him one day, what is your budget? And he says, 100,000. I said, wow. And back those days, that's a lot of money. I said, how can Eastman Kodak justify $100,000 for you to play around on Bays Mountain, which is a wonderful recreation area, and was aimed primarily at the Eastman Kodak employees? He says, it's easy. We get higher productivity. We get more than $1 back for every dollar we spend. And that got me to thinking, you know what? There's a reason for having recreation more than me just liking it. But Bev Driver is what brought that out, and I then kind of related back to those conversations to understand it. But there's a whole body of thought, and I think the one source that is this, and is a book called The Benefits of Leisure, Venture Press, 1991. I had my eyes opened there. We had some, it was by invitation only, about 18 different professions were represented, all the way from medical, psychologists and all that. Very few recreation people were there. They spent 2 days giving refereed papers on the values of leisure activities to personal health, to mental health, and on and on. And that's when finally it kind of turned on for me. I says, my Lord, we're into something much bigger than I ever thought. I had no idea that it was so valuable to everybody. And so that made me kind of a zealot from then. I've gotten a lot of people's faces after I understood why. And if you haven't read that book, I encourage you to get it. Fred Kaiser and I co-authored something about, why management needs to know about benefits. And I've reread it, and it's as true today as it was when we wrote it.
So in terms of your own accomplishments then, and translating that to the profession, how do you feel that's one of the major things you were able to do?
Oh, I don't know if it's major. It's certainly one of the important things. It's a work in progress. One of the things working with NSPR, we set up some training courses so we could expose that thought. And I still remember when we had a Corps of Engineers group. I had a leadership team, and there was early stages of the benefits concept, and I brought Bev Driver and Don Bruns and a couple of the people who really do well in that field down to do some kind of semi-training. And I told that group, I says, well, I just want you to be exposed to it. I want you to understand it. Well, they just ran right over me, because I just had told them, well, all we're going to try to do here is make sure they understand what's coming on. They took it and incorporated it into core policy. Right. And that was one of my high points. I mean, I couldn't believe those guys. They ran so far past me. My expectations were too low. And, they're a cynical bunch. They've got work to do. And I didn't have any idea. But when you start getting that religion, you can't turn it off. And when you understand the value of this profession, then it's easy. And so a lot of work that people think is difficult becomes easy when you understand what you're an evangelist for. And that, from that standpoint, I think that's kind of a peak, and I keep looking over my shoulder to see what the next better idea, because each time I thought where we were was it, and then next we discovered, well, we didn't have it all there. But this, and we say benefits, but it's really outcomes, because not all outcomes are beneficial. Some are negative as well.
What about the economic impacts? The ability to express these economic benefits?
I spent a lot of time working with the Office of Management and Budget and trying to sell them various aspects of the program. And we had a lot of data. The one that comes to mind most that I thought highly of was the travel cost method. So you get X dollars worth for your, Well, I'm pretty good at reading body language, and we start talking about that. Those OMB budget examiners just turned it off. They had no interest in that. And I got to, when you work with people, because it's pretty hostile. I mean, their whole job is to cut you. That has nothing to do with helping you. But I tried to figure out, well, what in the world would turn them on? And so I started exploring around and found that jobs and dollars were about all they talked. If you could talk that with them, then they'd listen. So then I became an evangelist in this area. This is before the benefit stuff really came on. It's really one of the benefits. And I did a lot of speaking at universities and things, and my price was I wanted to have an hour with their economist, whoever might be a natural resources economist, and I would pick their brain about this stuff. And we finally got to the point within the Corps that we started doing some work to develop the concept of economic impacts. And that's a gangbusters thing, because politicians, boy, when they hear that there's going to be more jobs or more money come into their district, they perk up. Well, more importantly, their staff perks up, because that's who really runs a lot of things. And so that program within the Corps, we had it broken down, I could tell you by congressional district, by lake, whatever, the jobs, everything, and how it related to what the budget was, and it became a really strong tool in selling the program. More than benefits. Benefits still hasn't reached the point there, but if you want to get a congressman's ear, you tell him we're going to put 32 more jobs. That doesn't sound like much, but any new job, if he can support some part of the budget and get 32 jobs out of it, and then you show him that it's a ratio of 24 to 1, you know, federal budget versus what he'll get into his community, they listen. Their staff listens. And so it became a very good persuasive tool. So it's a very successful program.
You kind of went out and observed and figured out how to beat them at their own game in some regards by convincing them
that's
about
what it's all
the side
about.
of it.
Yeah, you're not passive. If you're passive, you're not getting anywhere.
Yeah,
and so I've always been a kind of a passionate person, but it comes from understanding the value of what you have that you're working with, and that's why I was talking about that. Once you understand that, you can become very passionate. In most of my career, I've been a pushy son of a gun, and yet working within an environment that you don't get your way, so you just have to be persuasive.
Well, talking to people that work with you and for you, I heard a lot about the philosophies and how you demanded certain kinds of things. And so what kind of philosophies did you preach?
Well, pretty simple. And anybody that I brought on board, and some extremely talented, I think really one of my talents is identifying quality people, looking back, or else just damn lucky, one or the other. But they got what I call the integrity lecture, and they all knew about for that. But I gave them about a 10-minute lecture on the insistence on integrity in their performance, honesty at all steps, even if being honest did not support what we were doing, and it might be a detriment to our plan. And I got that, and it was a source of power, because we really were able, because remember now, I've always worked in a minority program. Recreation, in TVA, in BLM, and the Corps of Engineers is not top drawer.
Absolutely.
So you're always uphill working up, and that's why you need passionate people there. Otherwise, you'd just be run over. But over time, as you build a credibility of being an honest person at all steps, I was able, and my staff was able, to win debates that on the merit of the facts, we probably wouldn't have. But we were so credible, and others weren't. They chose the low road too many times, and it cost them. And so once somebody worked in our family, I always talked about family, it wasn't a staff, that sense of being honest and straightforward, it made us a little obnoxious at times. And people would say, well, if you hadn't brought that up, we could have done something. But in the long run, it really paid off, and it made us much more powerful. And I don't know how many times over the years I had my peers, other supervisors that had much more powerful programs than I. They'd come in and say, well, Darrel, how do you do it? And I said, well, first I'd tell them, well, I just pick good people and turn them loose. They said, yeah, but you know, and I says, well, you have to work on integrity. Well, once you've given up your integrity, you can't get it back. It's a one-time thing. And more than one person, while they wouldn't say it, I could tell that they realized that they were goners. They had lost it, because it's not unusual, especially in a headquarters staff, for people to not necessarily lie, but lie by omission, fail to bring up the negative in something, and over time that would cost, and you can't get that back once you lose it. And so our team was powerful, and it sounds so simple, but just being honest and straightforward at all steps, and a little bit obnoxious doesn't hurt, was how we carried forth. And we had a high win ratio in our various issues that we had to work on.
And that spun off into your capabilities to get things done across the board?
It really did, yeah.
Even outside of recreation? Didn't you influence others in the court to kind of understand that power issue?
Well, I tried, but too many people had already sold themselves.
Okay, so that's what
Yeah,
you were saying.
when people came to me and asked, how do you do it? And I'd explain to it, but they'd already sold their integrity. It wasn't recoverable. And so we talked about some of the lesser things, but I still say that's the most powerful thing you have. I would get called in by assistant secretary staff on stuff that's not related to what I did at all, and they would immerse me in it and then say, well, what do you think? Because they knew that Darrel Lewis would tell them what it really was.
That integrity.
Yeah. I got sent off to places that I didn't even want to go to. Buffalo, New York one time. Just next day, I want you up there. I want you to take a look at it, and you come back and report to me. I want to know what you think. And it was based entirely on that reputation that you build and maintain of being an honest broker.
Well, what do you feel about the park and recreation professionals of today then? What's been the most rewarding side on that?
Well, first, they're all crazy because there's better pay.
That's a good lead in.
And I love them all because I are one. I think they're better prepared than when you and I came into this. I mean, that's no tough thing to say. I mean, they really are. I'm just so impressed with a lot of them. I think that there are good ones and bad ones. I think there's some that are just coasting, and I'm ashamed of them. But I also see those that are carrying it another step. They're going forward, and they're proceeding with good things against strong odds. I mean, the current situation with the nation being at war and funds being tight are really making it difficult for the professionals, particularly in the federal sector, to maintain viable programs. I think the people out there doing that are extremely capable, and that craziness I mentioned is the screening, because if you don't have the passion, you're not going to be there.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
And so it's a selective process. And you may have people at the lower grades that don't make it, but the people who rise up in the main are the ones that have the passion, that go the extra mile. And I can't think of a better group to be associated with in any field. And I cross over fields a little bit. I know other fields. And these people, they're just flat out crazy, but they're in love with their work, and they have a sense and a foundation of why they're doing it, and that's just hard to beat.
Well, that's the key. This is the persistence to keep on keeping on and survive and keep your points.
Anybody watching
forward.
this video is surely going to be within the field, I'm sure, and they know what we're talking about. There's an uphill battle most days, and if you don't enjoy a good fight, get in another field.
There you go, because there's been a lot of fights to keep this one up.
Yeah, there are.
But significant problems. Now, what do you think those might be?
Boy, I think the loss of understanding of the value of leisure activities by the general public, but more importantly, the political powers. And that's our fault. Max, you and I have not got it done. We have to pass this on to the new crop. We haven't. We've built a lot of base of knowledge, but it has to be communicated. We've got to get the word out. I heard a radio commercial coming over here that talked to dealing with the obesity issue and getting people outdoors and in parks. It had nothing to do with the park and recreation profession. It's as easy as can be, and yet we haven't picked it up and run with it. It's very frustrating to me. I was fortunate enough to be in a number of White House initiatives on health and obesity and all that, and I was amazed at the programs that were available, and yet when I started getting excited, the guy who was running it, whose name I won't get, he says, "Darrel, you may want to back off. This is just window dressing. We're not going to do this." Frustrating as all get out. Other problems, I think, one of my pet peeves, and I have a lot of professor friends and research friends, and they kind of wince when they see me coming, and I got that look in my eye, because I am really frustrated by the quality of research in our field. That book I mentioned, the research being done in other fields, I hadn't seen any of that stuff. They're not only not getting it, they're dealing in what I consider a low level within the profession. We're talking about some extremely important elements of human behavior and life, and we're talking about, you know, some pretty mediocre topics in our research field, only a few exceptions. And there are those who I'm just proud to be associated with, but the majority of our research fails. When you start finding out that a medical refereed research report speaks to the fact that the availability of scenes versus a plain hospital wall when somebody's recovering actually increases the rate of recovery. Where is that in our research? Where are we using that to persuade people that we need parks and that parks should be protected? It's not there. And yet it has definable, researched, quantified values. That's where I'm really frustrated, and I've just beat up on more of these guys, and I'm just not sure it's in the research community at the moment. It doesn't seem to be there.
Well, I know the Academy's efforts through the Journal of Leisure Research are always looking for new focuses and new topics, and I think there is a mechanism, but communicating that and making it happen is yet to be done in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure in the Academy of reviewing some of the research papers, and a few of them get it. Yeah. But who's reading them?
Well, that's the key.
That's
I
part of
mean,
the
if
problem.
the book gathers dust on the shelf, it goes unsaid still.
Well, there's it's the benefit stuff, I think, is where a lot of that stuff is coming forward. That's why I'm so supportive of that. That actually speaks to why.
Yes.
And it really answers the question why. Why even think about recreation, outdoor recreation, leisure activities? Why? And it answers it in spades, and it's continuing to beef up. There's a gentleman named Don Bruns, works for the Bureau of Land Management, that is a real champion. And John Marnell from the Corps of Engineers, and Scott Jackson. There's a nucleus, but we just need to carry it that next step, and that's where you and I are passing the baton to the new Young Turks. And believe it or not, looking at us, we were Young Turks at one time, weren't we, Max?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I want to talk about one other area, though, that really has frustrated me, and it's kind of combined. One, the low priority that's given to leisure. It's just always there's a work ethic, Protestant work ethic at work here that just tends to think of it as having no value. And the low priorities that result from that thinking. And it's all based on a lack of understanding. We haven't done our job of educating decision makers on the values. And every once in a while you get a congressperson or a senator that gets it. And then, but they're alone. And they can't carry it alone, and they need to hear a groundswell.
Well, and about the time you get one educated, they disappear, and another one comes on the scene, and you got to be committed to going back and doing it over and using the personality traits of that person. But what about as far as the attributes for the profession? I mean, in summary, integrity is certainly been your key. What else?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of what a professional should have, and we're talking to people aspiring or in the early stages, I think the thing that I valued as much as anything else, after you got past my integrity speech, had to do with persuasiveness, both in oral and written word. you've got to be succinct, and you've got to be able to really persuade people, either in your oral presentations or your written word. And that all bases right back to what we've been talking about, the values. Because once you understand why it's important, you can articulate that. You can't do that if you're just talking about campgrounds and trails and that type of thing. That isn't what it's about. So that area. The other area that really gets to me is the I guess, for a lack of a better word, the ignorance by the middle level, the decision maker ignorance. Because when we went out, Dillon, Montana, the BLM went out there and took this benefits concept and said, we want to talk not about just the trails and things, but why do you want leisure activities resources here? Those people explained it to the bureaucrats.
Yeah.
They wanted their children to be healthy, to be strong. They wanted them to have these attributes and all that. They could have written the benefits thing. And here we were, a bunch of darn bureaucrats trying to tell them. But if you go up, see, there you talk to the public. They understand it and they get it and they're pushing it. If you go up to a manager, dare I say an engineer or a forester, well, I don't know about this stuff. They're not comfortable, they don't understand it, and they're not comfortable in incorporating it into it. I was lucky in the Army Corps of Engineers because the military side, the decision makers, got it because they've always perceived the value of R&R, recreation and relaxation for their troops. They saw the recuperation that resulted from that. And so when I could get to the military people, that was a fairly easy sell. But you can convince an engineer who's all into work that this leisure stuff is worthwhile and has a value to the nation, that's another story. So that lack of knowledge, or what I'd term ignorance, has been the handicap that a lot of us in the profession have had to work with.
Well, I can understand that, and I agree with you. The people, I guess, have been, is that the center, perhaps, the people that you've worked with as far as your career?
Oh, I think so. Ever since I kind of remember, I felt that the biggest reward was in developing people and seeing them blossom and become professionals. And I've been fortunate enough to an awful lot of people like that. And it's very rewarding. But not only that, it's very effective. Because I've always been able to build a staff into a group of individuals who could carry on independently. And so instead of one, some of my peers, they were the only person that could carry something forward. I had, 7, 8, 15 people who were all doing what I call God's work. And it was much more effective, and we got much more done that way. And seeing those people blossom, it's amazing. Almost anybody, if you give them the opportunity, you hold them accountable, but if you give them the opportunity to take something and run with it, and don't take it out of their hands. I won't name names, but there was an individual in our organization that would ask us for information, and then when we went forward to brief, he would take it and do the briefing and mess it up big time and cave in when he shouldn't have. And I swore during those meetings that I'll never do that to any staff I ever were a supervisor, and I never did.
Well, that's great. Darrel, it's great that you're staying involved. You didn't, you left your job, you didn't leave your profession, you're staying in it.
That's what I said in my retirement.
Well, that's commendable, and we look forward to working with you, and glad we had the chance to share this together, old friend, and hopefully these people that are coming along and looking at possible leadership in the profession can gain something from the discussion that we've had this morning. Appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
It's the same here.